Good morning, everyone. It is an absolute delight and honor to be a part of this conversation. So I'd like to, first of all, begin with a word of appreciation to the conveners and the organizers, and certainly to all of you. Over 100 years ago, a woman who was not a public health expert, not a gerontologist, not a physician, history tells us that Callie G. House was a washerwoman, a laundress, a seamstress. She nevertheless built an organization of between 300,000 and 600,000 people all across the country, dedicated to two objectives. The first of which was to provide for the well-being of elderly, indigent, often infirm, formerly enslaved Black people all across the country. And second, to seek federal reparations. For this, she was prosecuted by her government, spent the better part of a year behind bars. And so this morning's conversation literally has the wind of history behind us. And so it is with a great deal of humility and honor that we convene this conversation, these experts, and these people for this occasion. So I'd like to introduce, in this order, Dr. William Sandy Darity, who is the Professor of Public Policy and Africana and African American Studies and the Director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. And with appreciation, he's coming to us from North Carolina over Zoom. And Dr. Dania Francis, the Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And she comes to us here in person to my right. And Dr. Jemadari Kamara, who is a Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the co-author of the Boston Reparations Ordinance, which is up before the City Council this very afternoon. So there's a certain propitiousness and synchronicity in this conversation. And Dr. Ruqaiijah Yearby, the Kara J. Trott Professor of Law, in Law at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. And she's also the co-founder of the Institute for Healing Justice and Equity. Each of these panelists brings an individual expertise as well as collectively an interdisciplinary breadth to this conversation on the toxic legacy of anti-Black racism in the United States and its impact on the health and well-being and certainly the inequality that Black Americans feel the brunt of in this present moment. To open the discussion, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to take 3 or 4 minutes to ground us in their research and work, and if possible, to share with us anything that even for this audience might be counterintuitive. Ruqaiijah, I'd like to start with you in terms of a focus, your focus on employment and how the history of Black employment has shaped Black health.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the organizers for bringing me here, Dr. Bassett, Dr. Linos, Dr. Williams. So my work tries to connect the ways that law, structural racism impacts employment opportunities for people of color, particularly women of color, and how that leads to health inequities. I am going to start just with the history after enslavement because it is so key, because it continues to impact our health and well-being. So after the end of slavery, we have the Black Code laws, which prevent Blacks from working outside of domestic and agricultural work. If workers tried to go outside of that, they were arrested for crimes and forced back into enslavement under the 13th Amendment, which allowed it. There were also laws in the South that prevented Blacks from being able to leave the South. Many of these laws were changed after the 1950s, but we continue to see the failure for laws to actually address the steering of Black individuals into low-wage occupations or their access to higher pay. And what does that look like? Currently, we can look at the data collected by the federal government and see lots of industries steering Black individuals, other people of color into low-wage jobs, particularly the tech industry, even if those individuals are equally qualified for higher wage jobs. We see them being paid less, even though Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prevents this discrimination. But people are paid less either based on pay, salary, history, particularly for women of color. We see shifting standards where if education is important, it's because white males have higher education. But when people of color have higher education, then education is not that important. We also see that when Blacks and women try to negotiate for equal salaries, that they are penalized for this work. And then finally, we see many workers, particularly Black individuals, Black women, being steered into low-wage jobs that do not provide paid sick leave, which has been associated with increased rates of COVID-19, infections, and deaths, as well as hospitalizations. And so what I want to highlight today throughout our conversation is the ways that structural racism, structural discrimination, structural sexism is perpetuated through law, and that has been associated with increased rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, as well as infant mortality rates for people of color.
Thank you. Dania, if we could just turn to you in terms of your field of economics. There's a growing body of literature in terms of public health that connects wealth to health. If you can give us a bird's eye view of how state and federal government has systemically denied Black families opportunities for both wealth generation and accumulation.
Absolutely, thank you. And I want to echo the thanks to the organizers and everyone for inviting me to this conference. I'm really excited to participate in this discussion. So I want to say that I was very appreciative of the grounding that Commissioner Bassett, Dean Galea, Dean Williams, Dr. Bevan all did, really making this connection between wealth and health, right? And so I want to underscore that a little bit just by saying that we know that wealth provides protection, right? A safety net, but it also provides access. And so access to good neighborhoods, to good networks, right? Access to opportunities. And so it's particularly important to recognize all of the opportunities along our history, our path, right? That our governments, local, state, and federal, had the opportunities to do the right things in terms of equity and chose the opposite direction. Right? And so we have this history of systemic denial of wealth accumulation to Blacks in the US. At the same time, this sort of systemic bestowal of wealth accumulating opportunities for whites in the US. And this is at every level of government, right? And so we can think about, going back to any of the moments where federal programs or benefits were decided to be implemented at the local level, right? Because local for Blacks in the Jim Crow South, which is where the majority of the Black population was living, meant that they were not going to be provided access to such programs like their GI benefits for veterans, like USDA farm relief for Black farmers, right? So any of these, you can think of any of these locally administrated programs meant that they were going to be systematically denied to Blacks in the US. Another, common, now commonly known issue would be redlining, right? Where the government sort of gave the guide map to financial institutions on how to do this type of discrimination that kept Blacks out of thriving neighborhoods, but even in Black neighborhoods kept them from thriving, right? From being able to have high levels of home ownership and stability. And then I can go on, but I'll stop at also talking about urban renewal, right? And the sort of, plowing through the raising of successful Black neighborhoods with highways and really just sort of cutting them up and displacing people. And for those who were not displaced and remained in these sort of broken neighborhoods, right, we know from recent research by scientists at Tufts that along these highways, there's much higher incidences of these microparticulates, right, the kind that are very small, to which they're, to my knowledge, are not regulated by the government, and are small enough such that when they're inhaled, they don't just stay with the respiratory system, right? They get in the blood, and they're related to things like stroke and heart disease and so on and so forth. So in this way, access to better neighborhoods, meaning directly access to better health, right? So I'll stop there because I can keep going on and on, but I just want to say that there are very clear connecting dots between access to health, access to wealth, and the denial of that access, and access to health.
Thank you so much. Your invocation of that ugly legacy brought to mind a phrase, urban renewal, Negro removal. Not all the Negroes were in fact removed, and there were real health consequences in terms of that legacy. Turning to our hometown, right? Jemadari, if we could just engage you on this ordinance. We're at a moment in which we have municipalities, certainly prominently Evanston, responding to the call for reparations. You have been a driving force behind the ordinance here in the city of Boston. And as a part of that ordinance, you laid out the racial harms in terms of housing, education, exclusion from the political economy. If you can just discuss this evidentiary predicate for your ordinance, this ordinance.
Thank you very much for that opening and the entree, particularly provided by my colleagues on the panel, as well as the prior speakers. The dean and professor were very important, I think, in helping to shape a context within which I'd like to address this question. Because given the tension that was described certainly earlier in the panel, relating to the morality, the moral issues, as well as the empirical data that we'll be discussing today, at the center of this is the question of power. Who controls power? We can't have this discussion without discussing the issue of political will. It's not whether the knowledge that we have, it's not the data. We have the knowledge. We know it was wrong. Who controls the question of the system and the systemic relationships that are impacting and continuing and perpetuating the system in which we reside? Context. We are living in a white settler colony. That's what this is. And in order to deal with the politics of control and power, when we speak of the question of repair and reparations, it's placed in the context of the anti-Black issues of racism that have destroyed our society. Race is a dialectic. My Blackness is defined and constructed in this society only in relationship to your whiteness. So that it's not what we're going to do for me. It's about how are we going to reconstruct our society. This is a global issue. And we are approaching that in relationship to the commission and the proposal that is being put forward. Global, in the fact that If we look at the UN Human Development Index, 3/4, I haven't done it this last couple of years, but when I did before, 3/4 of the nation states in the world that are at the bottom of the index were in Africa or led by people of African descent. Unless you believe in the biological inferiority of Black people, there must be some structural, systemic reason why that exists, as well as the data that we're talking about here today. The commission, which is being put forward today, and there's a working session, is not done by me. I was asked to contribute to a process. We have other contributors here, Ms. Moderator, who's also a co-author, and the counselors. I hope Councilor Mejia is here, who will be leading this political discussion as to whether our city wishes to take the step of putting together a commission, as has been done in a number of other cities in the country, Asheville, Evanston, the state of New York, to address this question, to begin to reflect on that, and how do we collectively begin to transform our society, our system here. It's not just what are you going to do for Black folks. Yes, there are transfers that are needed. We know the study here in Boston, 247,500, right, thousand to $8. We know the data. Question is, what are we going to do? How do we do that in a way that will not only help to diminish the wealth gap, diminish the health gap, but how will we transform our human relationships in this community, whether it's the school system, the housing? I'm so glad you raised this. You know, I came here today, some of you, I think, came on the highway. It was jammed up. That stuff. But I came across I-95.
Right.
You know I-95, right?
Mm-hmm.
I-95 is Melnia Cass. The destruction of neighborhoods, the destruction of communities right in front of us that we drive on every day. The trucks come on, the toxic fumes and so forth. That was, I-95 is right here. That destroyed this community, that separated where we are now from Roxbury, which is across the street. The repair that we're seeking to address by virtue of a commission to step back, to reflect on how do we focus on these issues in education, of health, to construct an education system, you know, educado, is to lead us out of, not to lead us in, to lead us out in ways that will reconstruct our human relationships. That's what we're trying to do with it.
So, Sandy, I'm coming to you last because I'd like for you to help.
Because I'm the oldest person here.
You just said something very witty and very funny, but I totally missed it.
I said because I'm the oldest person here.
Or the one with the most distinguished afro.
Yes, it's the only genetic defect that I don't have. Loss of hair.
But in addition to that, but I'm coming to you because your book really represents the Bible of the national discourse on reparations. In much the same way that Pauli Murray's book on the nation's state segregation laws represent the Bible, if you will, of the desegregation strategy at the dawn of the civil rights movement. You made in your book the historical, the economic, moral case for reparations. But there are a great many people who still don't make the connection between wealth and health. And I'd like for you to just pull some of these threads together and continue, notwithstanding the fact that the data is well known, the facts are well known, but they're not yet well received or widely received or politically received. So Darity, Sandy, if you could just make the case for us?
Well, first of all, let me say that the data on Boston is actually from a report that was produced by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in conjunction with my research center. So I'm very familiar with the $8 figure. The Fed is in the process of doing a new study. I suspect that the measure will not be as low as the one we found, but I think that the gap will be just as wide. And this is a gap that is consistent across all of the metropolitan areas in the United States, as well as rural America. It's a gap that exists across the nation as a whole. And it is a gap that is a very useful guide to measuring the magnitude of the size of an appropriate bill for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. There's two fundamental ways in which you could measure a reparations bill. First way is to enumerate all the atrocities that have been inflicted upon Black people in the United States, assign a dollar value to each of those atrocities, add it up. I think this is impractical and perhaps intractable. And what we have proposed in our book, what Kirsten Mullen and I proposed in our book that you mentioned so generously, is identify a summary measure that captures the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy and enables us to clearly define the amount of money that is due. So we are focused on is the Black-white disparity in net worth, which amounts to approximately $840,000 per household, or $350,000 per individual. This sets up the target for monetary reparation. It creates a target that's set at $14 trillion. This is the foundation or the baseline amount that is due to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And I say it's specifically due to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery because of the specificity of the debt that is owed to that community. It's a debt that is owed to that community because in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government promised the newly emancipated 40-acre land grants per household. Instead, the newly emancipated received nothing. In contrast, with another piece of legislation that I think Dania did not mention in her very, very important remarks about policy and the creation of the wealth gap. In contrast, the federal government provided 160-acre land grants to 1.5 million white families in the western territories of the United States. And they provided those land grants as the nation completed the colonial settler project that was mentioned a bit earlier. Those 160-acre land grants translate into a benefit for at least 45 million living white Americans in terms of their wealth position. The failure to provide Black American descendants of U.S. slavery with any compensation in the present moment is a tragedy that is consequent upon the failure to provide their ancestors with a financial stake in American society at the beginning of their period of emancipation. So I'll stop.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask the audience to just put a sticky note on that figure in terms of the wealth gap and the price tag that Sandy's placed on what it takes to bridge the wealth gap. Ruqaiijah, I want to turn to you before we leave this introductory session. You've described law as a tool through which structural discrimination shapes health. I'm not sure how many lawyers are in the room, but this is a loaded phrase in terms of culpability and responsibility. Tell us what you mean by it.
Yes, so part of my work is trying to bridge the gap between public health and law, and trying to show, as we talk about the social determinants of health and those factors outside of individuals' control, how law and structural racism are a root cause to many of those conditions. So I'm going to talk about two particular laws that are still in place and still limit people of colors, particularly women of color's ability to get paid high wages and then for wealth. So the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 built wealth for white workers and exempted out occupations that were predominantly held by racial and ethnic minorities. The NLRA allowed union protections for workers. It did not apply to agricultural workers, domestic workers, and service workers, which many people of color were forced to work in. If Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Indigenous worked outside of these occupations, the federal government allowed unions to discriminate against them and not cover them. That law has been changed to some extent, but still does not apply to agricultural workers, which are predominantly people of color and non-US citizens. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, again, didn't apply to most of these occupations. It still does not, in some cases, particularly for agricultural workers who may not be paid minimum wage. And think about it, their children are allowed to work, again, for below minimum wage. Domestic workers, which includes home health care workers, which I'll talk about a little later, are not, just became covered in 2015, but Trump put in a rule that allows many of those workers to be considered independent contractors. So why is this key? Because as been mentioned, that at various levels, federal, state, local, these laws that resulted in minimum wage and high wage jobs for white workers were denied to people of color and continue to be denied in terms of their protections. And the last thing I would say is that our COVID relief bills have often left many of these workers out, including home health care workers, agricultural workers, and including President Trump at one time was talking about increasing the number of visas to allow more agricultural workers in, and at the same time then talked about lowering their wages. And so this is key because we use law perhaps with neutral language to perpetuate structural racism, sexism, classism, and ageism, as well as against people with disabilities. So it is key for us to acknowledge that, but also I know part of your question was how do we begin to redress it? And it is by using these laws to force government to actually ensure that they are providing the things that people of color need, which is to say that if laws are disproportionately harming people, the government has a responsibility to treat everyone equally, and it is not. And so we need to hold them accountable for this disproportionate harm.
So Dania, Sandy has lifted up direct payments, and a figure that many are intimidated by. But 10 years ago, you and Sandy did a piece where you looked at the ripple effects of direct payments in terms of reparations across generations. And one of the things that you brought to light was that it would be hard to keep money within the Black community. As we discussed the prospect and possibility of reparations, the idea that reparations can be made but not kept is unsettling.
Yeah.
Tell us about your research.
Yeah, this is actually a project that Sandy and I and then also Badisha Lahiri Sandy and I started working on, what was it, Sandy, now, 20 years ago, and it was published 10 years ago, but the slow wheels of academia. That's right, it's one of these maybe counterintuitive results where we, applied some of the theory from international trade to demonstrate that it's quite possible that if you give a large lump sum payment, like cash transfers, as reparations payment, it's quite possible that it could actually lead to unintended consequences of further impoverishing Black communities if, right, there are no avenues through which those funds can be transferred to benefit Black communities. Now, I want to make sure, I'm very clear that we are not talking about, a cash payment being, conspicuously consumed or something like that. That's a paternalistic myth, and in fact, probably quite racist. And so what we're talking about is this notion that in this country, Black business ownership, I think one of the latest figures that a Brookings Institution report put out was 2.3% of businesses, right, in this country being Black owned in some way. So that if I had a reparations payment and I wanted to invest it, right, where would I invest it that isn't going to go right back into the same financial institutions that we know discriminate against Black people in lending and so on and so forth. And so I think our argument in that paper was not to say, for this reason, a cash transfer isn't a good idea. I think cash transfers are an excellent form of reparations, but rather to say, let's build this capacity now, right? There are organizations, nonprofit organizations, community development organizations that are doing this work. Let's support those organizations to make sure that when that time comes, there are avenues through which this money can be productively funneled to benefit Black communities.
As I listen to you, I think about the fact that Senator Edmund Pettus, the segregationist, he supported reparations because he thought if Black people got some money, white people would most certainly get some of it. But I hope the audience appreciated the nuance of your point, that it's not a matter of Black people overspending or spending lavishly or spending unwisely, but rather the need for a fiscal foundation, structures, institutions to ensure that we can leverage wealth. I want to open up the conversation to the whole of the panel and to specifically address the healthcare sector. So if we know that Black people benefit when they're treated by Black physicians, but we have a dearth of Black physicians, roughly 5%. This is a consequence of inequities in education at every level, and certainly healthcare institutions. What specifically can the healthcare industry do to be a platform for reparatory justice when it is so deeply infected by racism itself? This is a question for everybody, and you can tell the enthusiasm of the panel. Everybody's ready to jump right in.
I'll jump in.
Thank you.
So just like the educational system, the overwhelming number of teachers are white, particularly white women. In the medical system, the overwhelming number of doctors are not Black. They may not necessarily be white, but they're not Black. And so, as a consequence, we have to focus not only on the training of teachers, but we have to focus on the training of physicians as well, in a period in which we will continue to have a predominant presence of non-Black teachers and non-Black physicians. They have to be retrained so that the stereotypical beliefs that inform their actions are removed. And that's something a bit separate from a reparation project. Okay. The process of ending a harm is not identical with compensating for the harm, but we have to do both. It's like Malcolm X's observation about a situation in which somebody plunges the knife 9 inches into your back, and he distinguishes between pulling the knife out and healing the wound. So ending the harm is pulling the knife out. Healing the wound is the act of reparative justice. We need to do both. And let me also add that we actually have some strong evidence now emerging from a variety of studies that suggest that the types of health disparities that we observe today would be far smaller had we addressed the racial wealth disparity. There's a study that was led by Eugene Richardson and James Jones that shows that had the racial wealth gap been eliminated prior to the onset of the pandemic, COVID-19 infection rates would have been 31 to 68% lower. And that's across the entire population. In addition, Dr. Katie Himmelstein has led a team that has produced a report that indicates that the mortality differential between blacks and whites would be virtually eliminated if we had no racial wealth gap.
And I want to jump in to say there are things that the healthcare system can do related to reparations. One, they can pay their low-wage workers, who are women and predominantly people of color, a living wage. They can make sure that they have access to health insurance, and they can make sure, as some of the biggest landowners in low-income areas, that they do not push those residents out, that they provide housing and improve that community with the thought of supporting the communities that are there. Many of those institutions overcharge those residents. They include them in medical research, and they do not receive the benefits of that research. So if we want healthcare institutions to be held accountable, there is a debt that is to be paid to those individuals who they have harmed. And it should look like higher wages, health insurance, a community that is thriving.
Anyone else?
Yes, I'd like to focus on a dimension of this. I'm not a medical doctor, so this is a question of physical health, which is the context within which I understood the question. Is not my specific area of expertise. However, I do live in a society in which W.B. Du Bois talked about living in the state of double consciousness. And not being a medical doctor, but I have understood that if I have a state of duality in my consciousness, I think there's a medical term, they call it schizophrenia. And if my normative state of being is living in this kind of context, then if I reach out to seek care, I must be interacting with someone who can understand what my state of being is. And if there is no cultural sensitivity to that, there's going to be a misdiagnosis. I might even become the problem, as opposed to being able to have someone who can help me arrive at a solution. Recently, there has been a study done by Cobra, and I was glad to see my brother Cam Howard here. It speaks to the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance that blacks in this country have received. And I think this is clearly an area in which we need to do more research, more investigation, because the mental health consequences of living in this environment, in the context of the systems of oppression that are defined by the data and the physical consequences of this, I think we need to do much more to engage in order to be able to begin the process of the repair that has to go on.
So I want to pair you and Sandy in a conversation or response with respect to reparations. So Sandy's come up with a $14 trillion price tag. And the responses to reparations are essentially threefold. The first of which is it is untimely. The harm happened too long ago. This is the Mitch McConnell argument. Two, it's unworkable, programmatically, administratively impossible. And lastly, that it is unaffordable. We simply can't afford it. Sandy has been an incredible and forceful advocate with respect to federal reparations. You are a forceful advocate for municipal reparations. If both of you can talk about affordability, but also the compatibility of a federal effort for advocacy for federal reparations and municipal efforts for reparations. In other words, what happens in Boston, is it necessary and sufficient, right, given the harm? At the federal level, is that necessary and sufficient? Or even if it's necessary, is it sufficient relative to what happens at the city level? Do we need both and or?
Our conversation today from our earliest panel, I think is clearly laid out a frame for us that this is not an either or conversation. Either health or education or social justice, it's both and. It is not a local conversation that this has to be taken care of in Boston. I live in Boston, so I have to deal with my block. But I also live in the context of the United States. And federal policy clearly has broad implications for what is even possible in Boston, but it's not either or. HR 40, can we talk about, can I say that here? National legislation.
It's not an obscenity, and it's a piece of federal legislation.
National legislation, which has taken a form in our Congress called HR 40, was actually formulated on legislation submitted in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts by Senator Bill Owens, who submitted the first piece of legislation in the 20th century for repair here in this Commonwealth, which, just as HR 40, never had a hearing. However, the policies that we're addressing with regard to HR 40 and the commission, which has to be initiated here, also happens in a global context. We're talking about fiscal repair at the time of emancipation. The British government, as you know, emancipated those who had been enslaved years before we did in this country. But in so doing, they chose to pay 20 million pounds to the slave owners, which was 1/5 of the GDP of England at the time. Do we have the resources? Absolutely, we have the resources. How much is being expended with regard to Eastern Europe? I don't know if we want to go there today, but the question is the political will. Do we have that? In city of Boston, the data I think is referencing about $9 billion. It's 3 times the municipal budget. We don't need it all tomorrow. I mean, we can work this out over time. 14 trillion. I mean, we can work over time. I mean, how many decades has it taken? Hundreds of years. We can do that. Layaway is okay.
Sandy, I think you may be of advantage where you're familiar with the layaway plan. For those of you who are of a certain age, this is where you paid by the week. Okay.
I'm sorry.
We want to be clear what we're referring to.
Thank
So,
you.
but Sandy, you've
With a
been
very high implicit interest rate.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Uh,
But yeah, Sandy, if you can speak to that, but also the compatibility of federal and municipal efforts at reparations, because I've heard you express some apprehension about the multiplicity of efforts with respect to municipal reparations versus federal reparations, with the federal government being the only one with the capacity to bridge the racial wealth gap.
So I have reservations about a variety of what I refer to as piecemeal efforts to introduce what people are calling reparation. I would be fine with any of these local or state or personal or private initiatives if they were not labeled reparation. And this is a large measure because if you set as your objective, your minimal objective, elimination of the racial wealth gap, this is something that cannot be accomplished by private sources, nor can it be accomplished by state and local governments. The combined budget of all state and local governments in the United States amounts to less than $5 trillion. If you have a $14 trillion bill, even if you spread it over multiple years, and in our book from Here to Equality, Kirsten Mullen and I say it should not be spread over more than a decade. But even if you spread it over multiple years, states and localities do not have the capacity to meet that task. Individual donors, if you had individual donors who made contributions of $1 billion on a monthly basis to a reparations fund, in effect, $12 billion per annum, we could only get to the $14 trillion figure in a millennium. So it's the federal government alone that has the capacity to meet a bill of this magnitude. But I would also argue it's the federal government that is the culpable party. Because of the array of policies that Dania talked about, the policies that I mentioned associated with land allocation in the aftermath of the Civil War, a racially uneven distribution of land, you have a situation in which it's the federal government's policies that have reduced the racial wealth disparity. And it's the federal government that has primary responsibility for meeting that gain. One last comment, because I think there's a difference in perspective between two of us who are speaking now. One last comment. I think the idea of the formation of a commission to provide Congress with proposals for reparation is a sensible idea. It's precisely what was done as a prelude to the Japanese-American reparations plan. Unfortunately, I do not think that H.R. 40 is the legislation that will produce a commission that will do the right job. And I would love to refer people to an editorial that my partner Kirsten Mullen wrote for Bloomberg, in which she enumerates in great detail the severe flaws and weaknesses associated with H.R. 40.
Excellent. So we want to afford everyone else on the panel an opportunity. We talked about culpability, capacity with respect to reparations. What do we call it? Reparations, or is it something else? When universities, municipalities, private actors engage in trying to bridge or address racial harms. But is there a business case for reparations? Right?
Yes, I'd like to speak to this, particularly in light of the last set of comments, because in framing the issue, not as either or, we need to acknowledge the recent report by Harvard, legacy study, $100 million that is being put forward as a, I think, an initial gesture for discussion, I would hope.
Layaway.
You're part of the layaway, right? But that we're talking about the repair as the societal repair. This is about money, but it's about more than just money. Mm-hmm. It's about a question of systemic social transformation. Mm-hmm. And in that transformative process, we have to deal with one of the major institutions that created the structure that rationalized the process in the first place, which is the church. Mm. We have to deal with institutions of higher education. Yes, there's a group of, over 40 institutions of higher education that are now acknowledging their role. Harvard now having stepped forward, Georgetown, many of the others, that many also happen to be Catholic, but maybe there's a reason why. There's some link there. That this is a broader discussion, the piece of legislation acknowledging a political dimension of this, and requiring the political will to do this requires an engagement of our communities, of our society. We may have a critique of H.R. 40 as a piece of legislation, but national legislation is required. We will not have political pressure to enact any form of legislation if there's not local conversation, discussion, and acknowledgement and transformation at that level. Mm. And what happens in the United States will have a direct and inextricable relationship with what is happening in Europe, because the European governments are now being challenged by many of the colonized or formerly colonized states that are now being empowered to engage in this process with European powers as well. It's not just here. This is a much broader confirmation about the kind of world and set of relationships beginning in our community that we want to have.
Well, thank you for both providing the global context, but also reminding us of the moral predicate for reparations. In other words, by invoking religious institutions, we're reminded of the fact that Callie House traveled the country, traveled the South, to churches, listing people in an effort for reparations. But what I'd like to do is end on this question. We've talked about the economic price of action, the cost of reparations in terms of individual payments and the racial wealth gap. But what about the cost of inaction? If each of you could address that, the cost of inaction in terms of healthcare and health equity, the cost of inaction morally, historically, economically speaking.
Well, I'll just add that I think the cost of inaction, in my view, long term is catastrophic. I think that we've seen the widening of this wealth gap over time. We've seen the widening of health disparities over time, directly related to the widening of this wealth gap. And there's no reason to believe, especially since wealth is transmitted intergenerationally and access and opportunity are, that doing nothing won't lead to it to continue to widen, right? And so I think the status quo when doing nothing, in fact, would be maybe the worst, right? The worst outcome. And so it's not a matter of if we do nothing, we'll continue like we are. No, if we do nothing, we'll just see these disparities grow. The power structures continue to be in imbalance. And so there cannot be inaction.
I worked prior to coming here. One of my first jobs was in a prison. I taught in a prison. And when you see the human potential that resides in these institutions that are structured based upon a punitive response to our structural failings in this society, you cannot help but understand there must be another way. There must be another way that we, in our societies, in our communities, can begin to engage in a process of transformation that is different from what we have done and what we are reproducing now. And to continue to reproduce the school, we call it the school to prison pipeline, or just in that particular context, we cannot continue to do this. And we are wasting generations of potential, of capacity, of creativity, of innovation. We cannot continue to do.
Right.
I would just like to build on that to say that we cannot continue to do what we are doing and thrive. That we have to transform and understand that the harms that we cause to each other hurt ourselves. And so that reparations to me in this discussion is about us transforming and working together to create a thriving, healthy nation and world. And so we must move towards that. And I wanted to go back to what was said prior, is that this is always thought about as one group getting more than somebody else. And this is really about transforming and making our communities, this country, this world, thriving and healthy. And so that's what we must focus on. And how can we get there? How can we work together to accomplish that change?
I'll turn to Sandy a piece.
So I think doing nothing will have three adverse consequences. First is it will continue the nation on a path towards a set of genocidal practices directed against Black Americans. And if we use the UN definition of genocide, the kind of conditions that exist today, particularly associated with police executions of unarmed blacks, excess mortality and the like, are all indicators of various approaches towards genocidal regimes. The second thing is, if we stay on this path without taking an appropriate act towards reparative justice, the nation loses the suppressed talent of huge numbers of extraordinary Black young people whose abilities to display their talent and their gifts is being repressed. And then third, we continue a process of denial of Black America with the resources that would produce full citizenship. And if Black America had full citizenship, particularly in a circumstance in which the average Black household had a net worth that was essentially $1 million higher than the current moment, there would be a different political capacity on the part of the Black community that could lead to the types of social transformations that people are saying are essential for our future.
Powerful, very powerful. So I'll certainly end with this benedictory note. If we think about Callie House 100 years ago, she solicited signatures of American citizens all across this country by the thousands. And they advocated for reparations. We've arrived at this moment where the discourse around reparations has never been more robust. And so we simply left with this question. If our forebears did all they did with what little they had, what more can we do with all that we have been given? With that said, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the wonderful, wonderful discussion.